The 250th birthday of America? How can we celebrate the 250th birthday when the United States of America was clearly around way longer than 250 years from all of the indigenous native tribal people that were already living here? Trump and the MAGA sphere are spreading a totally distorted vision of the so-called 250th anniversary of 1776. The United States were founded on theft, violence, and large-scale exploitation. American history is nonetheless threaded through with astonishing popular struggles that are far too little known from many people. The American Revolution of 1776 was not born from a call for freedom or democracy, but from the theft of indigenous lands. The large slave-holding landowners of the 13 colonies were burning to seize these lands, even if it meant declaring independence is what they call. It really needs to be understood that these 13 colonies was not the first discovery of America, but it was actually a rediscovery of the ancient indigenous people, and there's a lot of deception around this. The English warlords owned many of this land, and they were employing tenant farmers for slaves. What most people fail to realize is that the prospect for enrichment of these colonies depended heavily on the seizure of these lands and moving more to the west of the country. France and its Amerindian allies hold the region on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains at this time. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 reshuffled the deck, and all they wanted was land. The British government of Virginia was promising these lands to their colonial militias. France is defeated and expelled from the continent. The British colonists crossed the Appalachian Mountains, and at the head of the great independent confederations, the Native American nations then attacked the English forts in the Pontiac's War. Thousands of civilians are killed on both sides. The empire is halted, and thanks to the swift reaction of the indigenous native tribal people, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 creates a vast preserved reserve. The west of the Appalachians remains forbidden to the British settlers, deprived of the gains from the 7 Years' War, and their resentment towards the king grows even more stronger. What most people fail to realize is that the Proclamation Emancipation sought less to protect the Native Americans than to actually control the settlers. The king wanted to prevent their dispersal and keep them on the coast in order to anticipate any spillover and tax them even more heavily. These guys are corporate thugs. The so-called founding fathers of the United States are directly driven by land speculation. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, they were the major landowners, and they were only determined to seize and get the land. And just to clarify, the so-called leading founding fathers, they had hundreds of slaves. Independence was in no way shaking the system of slavery, despite the grand principles of its declaration that all men are created equal. That was never what America was founded on. The 7 Years' War was largely due to the intentions of the British Crown, making new taxes pile up very rapidly. The elite of the 13 colonies continues to wage on, and with the claim for parliamentary representation, the protests take on a more political form under the influence of what was called the European Enlightenment. Democracy is associated with anarchy. The elite founding fathers were fearing that the demagogues would call upon the populace to attack its newfound fortune. The democratic ideal does not engender the American Revolution, but on the contrary, the rebellion facilitates the popularization of emancipatory principles. There was much debate about the War of Independence from 1775 to 1783. The armies were feeding themselves off of the land of the native tribal indigenous peoples. The militias plundered the farms. Even some of the rare native tribes were siding with the American patriots, but it does not excuse them from the theft and the deportation that was following the Treaty of Versailles. There was about 150,000 Native Americans that were driven westward without even putting up a fight. Now, the native indigenous tribal people did not give up without a fight. The brutal conquest of the Great Lakes, and it was defined by the most severe retreat of battle ever inflicted on the United States by the Native Americans. The Battle of the Wabash in 1791 is even one of the most worst debacles in its history. Only about 5% of the soldiers actually returned unscathed from the St. Clair defeat. And so the American Revolution actually boosted the process of permanent conquest through their systemic wars against the tribal indigenous Native American nations. Manifest Destiny would theorize this territorial expansion as early as 1845, normalizing extortion and deportation. And don't ever forget that Cristobal Colon, otherwise known as Christopher Columbus, he was a tiny hat. Don't ever forget it.